A whole new global talk show, Newstellers. Let's meet our panelists. As you can see, we have a new face in the studio today. Please welcome Mr. John Power to Newstellers. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Thanks
Welcome,
for having
John.
me.
Welcome, John.
Great to have you. You're originally from Ireland, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. I came to Korea in 2010 and I've been working in media since then.
Enjoying your time here?
Yep, absolutely. It's always interesting to work in a foreign country as a journalist, especially, I think.
Okay, great to have you, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to say on today's topic, and the rest of you, of course. A 6-year-old albino boy had his hand savagely hacked off recently in Tanzania, Africa. According to the UK Daily Mail, Baraka Cosmas was attacked by a group of men who stormed into his house in Kipenda, the southwestern region of Rukwa, last March. The vicious assault is the latest in a long line of attacks on albinos, whose body parts are believed to act as charms, bringing good fortune in African countries, especially when the general election starts in October. In response, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights called for increasing protection for albinos, calling the brutal attacks dire. So we're talking about a horrific situation here. I mean, it's incredible that in this day and age, witch doctors are still touting these beliefs. What were your reactions to this story?
They think that the parts of the body of albino people give them good luck and stuff, and they just chase them and murder them. And I think it's really, really horrible. I mean, it's kind of an extreme case of violating of children's rights.
No, there's no scientific evidence that these body parts have any special power or anything, and maybe have some kind of like a public information campaign to change these very unfortunate practices.
I think the Tanzania government is trying to do things. For example, I read that there is one member of the parliament that is albino. So I think that is just maybe when there is this deep, like this popular belief are so deeply entrenched.
So are there any specific measures or initiatives that the government are taking to protect such children?
So first, as I mentioned, having a member of parliament that is albino, and they set up some care center, where, like shelters, basically.
Yeah.
But their shelters were criticized, actually, because the conditions there are not very good.
I think as well it highlights a very interesting thing for people outside the country like us, which is how do you look at another culture, another country, another context, and try and help and have that accepted without making the local people defensive and trying to understand the dynamics of the country itself. So I think there's definitely a role for people outside the country to push for human rights, but I think it's also very important for any change to come from the ground level in the country itself. And I think that's always going to be the most effective.
Indeed, we'll be going into much more detail during the show, but let's get into the topic: rights for the child, rights for the future. Now, Fred, you're the only one here among us who has a child so far, but the rest of us may have children at some point. But it's not our own children that are precious to us only. Obviously, every child across the globe matters. So can we talk about the international treaty established by the United Nations to protect the rights of children?
In November 1989, for the first time, there was open to signature the United Nations Convention for the Rights of Children that sets out very basic rights such as political, economic, social, health, cultural rights for children. And actually now most of the countries in the world signed it, are parties to it. There is 195, I think the last figure, country are part to it, including South and even North Korea.
Right.
And what's interesting is that there is somehow some kind of a monitoring mechanism. So countries who are party to it are supposed to show the progress and to show how they respect this convention, even though this is not enforced, I have to say.
It's not enough by itself, but I still think that this UN Treaty on Children's Rights is important, at the very least as a symbolic way and as a kind of way of codifying a set of very basic principles for children all over the world to say no matter where you are born, if you are a kid, you are entitled to these specific rights. Of course, the UN doesn't have the mechanisms to go into individual countries and compel them to follow certain principles, but I still think it's a worthwhile piece of legislation.
Okay, so it looks like as a global community we are moving forward to protect the rights of children and in issues related to children. But there were times when it was actually unthinkable to even think about rights for children. I mean, they were usually made to work.
I mean, the whole industrial revolution started with making children work. If you look, you see amazing pictures that were taken only a century ago when you see children working like from 5 to 14 years old, working in mines, working in factories, and they were working up to 16 hours a day.
Wow.
They were working in fields, and it was considered as normal. The first law that they didn't prevent the child labor, they just limited the working time. This is the first law. It was only a century ago.
Yeah, actually, in the 1960s, 25% of the children of the world were working, were child labor. Now it's around 10%. And well, there's a definition actually. Not every children working is supposed to be wrong in some way. The child labor is defined as employment of children that deprives them to go to school, deprives them to do a normal life, and is harmful for them. These days, there are 168 million children working in those conditions in the world. It's like 10% of the world population. This child labor is a really, really big problem in the world that has to be solved.
Okay. So we've talked about children's rights as a global issue, and the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon recently visited 5 countries across Central Asia to stress the importance of human rights protection. So let's see which issues he chose to raise. According to the AFP, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon urged Uzbekistan to stop using forced labor in cotton fields. Uzbekistan is among the world's largest producers of cotton, but has been criticized by the international community, who are calling for crackdowns on basic freedoms. Uzbekistan citizens, including children, are obliged by the state to work in the cotton fields. Pretty pressing issue, I would say.
Yeah, in Uzbekistan, the government actually forces both adults and children to pick cotton for its very large industry there. And actually the last harvest, 11 people died, such were the conditions. They've got very strict quotas, I think 70 kilos a day was what I read.
Per person?
Yeah, and then they
Amazing.
can face consequences like detention or expulsion from school if they don't comply with those demands.
Yeah, actually, even the EU, the European Union, is mentioning this issue very recently in a meeting with the head of government in this region. But I think that they will not change much. I think this example shows that even there is criticism for the international community, whether Ban Ki-moon or European Union, we don't have much leverage to convince this government to stop employing.
Also on the business side, there's a very strong Korea connection because the principal processor of the material is a Korean conglomerate.
Okay.
And that issue has been controversial for some years, and the company has addressed it. And it's claimed that it's asked the government to change its labour methods, but it also has declined to stop using the material produced. So as well as sort of supranational pressure or government pressure, there's also the issue of the ethical consumer and what consumer decisions people make, and that's another potential way to address this.
I think in the developed countries, we should have laws to prevent the big companies to use those kind of products from that kind of workforce, because it's especially outrageous, the case of Uzbekistan, because it's the government who is deliberately violating the rights of their children.
I mean, the government, of course, has the power in this situation because this is like a state-orchestrated, nationwide thing that, I mean, this is also an abuse of the grown-ups' rights. I mean, they're working without pay, they're working, against, they don't have the freedom to choose or to refuse this. But you also have to, kind of follow the cotton after it leaves Uzbekistan. Where does it go? And, we all need to make informed choices as consumers.
I'd also be surprised if Uzbekistan's neighbours and, its trading partners don't have considerable leverage on this issue, because if their economy is so dependent on this product, then I think countries could say, well, we're really not happy about this if they were so inclined. But, perhaps they just don't see it as a priority issue.
Okay. Okay. And I believe similar things are happening in Pakistan, who also has a large cotton industry. Are there any other countries that you can think of that exploit children to such a large extent?
I have an example. Maybe it's not a very large extent, but it shows how difficult it is. It's Samsung, actually. Samsung, of course, they say they have a very strict no child labor policy. They have a factory in China where it turned out that they were employing child workers without knowing it. And it was thanks to an NGO, because Samsung was doing audit, but they didn't find this labor violation. And it was a local NGO that did research, that did investigation, and then that showed that some minor was working for the subcontractor of Samsung. And that shows how difficult it is to put an end to this child exploitation.
Even for such large companies.
Yes.
Anywhere else?
In Niger, Saharan area of West Africa, I mean, in some parts of the country, slavery is perhaps not legal, but it's still widely tolerated. And so you have these cases of like children born into families where their parents are slaves, and them like going to school is never really a question. They have to work in these difficult situations for many years, and I think the government has taken steps to address it, but the problem is ongoing.
Yeah, I think the closest example to home, which is North Korea. Several weeks ago, I interviewed a North Korean defector who had worked in the country's mines from the age of 17. So she actually began as a miner. And what she described was extremely long days of very strenuous work.
Also in the Middle East these days we can find these kind of stories. For example, now that some countries are in a really unstable situation, like Syria that was that is suffering a war. Some refugees in a Jordan camp, some of the children, they're inside the refugee camp are starting to work and try to make their livelihood, just selling things, just making food. And the UN is looking at that these days too.
And in Philippines, there is 5.5 million children working. And I saw recently a TV report where we see children are 11 years old. They are gold miner, but they take gold under the water. So they dive with just a very thin tube, and they work in incredibly dangerous conditions just to make a couple of dollars a day.
So it's an ongoing problem across the globe, it seems. Why do you think this actually still happens in today's modern world?
I guess poverty is probably the biggest determining factor. You know, like there are children who will go to great lengths just to earn some money. And in the example that Ate gave, we're talking about refugee camps where children are, in most cases, there probably isn't like an infrastructure for them to attend school, so they're left with all this time, and they don't have food, they don't have the things that they need. So even children, in some cases, have a kind of entrepreneurial instinct, and they will look for ways to sell things, to have some way of improving their situation.
And there's a perennial debate about to what extent economic freedom translates into democracy and so on. There's a lot of debate about that, but I think there is still quite a strong connection, and what you will hopefully see is as countries become richer across the world, they will democratize and they will become more open to civil and labor rights and so on, and this will gradually improve.
I would blame it on governments, partly on governments. On one hand, governments of third world countries, that they are authoritarian, they are corrupt, and they don't care about their own people suffering lack of food and their own children dying. And on the other hand, the governments and companies from the first world, that they allow those situations, turning a blind eye and not making laws to prevent people taking advantage of these other poor countries. So I think the governments and companies, they have a lot to do about this problem.
But yeah, I agree. And except maybe for war situation where you cannot enforce the law, but in a peaceful situation, government should have law to force companies not to employ children, to oblige families to put their children into school.
So I think with any issues regarding children, it's something that makes journalists in particular stand up and notice. I'm sure the same goes for you guys. We see a lot of pictures in the media and being used by relief organisations, in fact. Pictures of kids, skin and bone, flies all over them. And I'm sure it appeals to the general public and in people wanting to help, but the basic human rights of those children are also at stake here. So a group of international organizations in Korea have established a set of media guidelines for children's rights when reporting. So let's see what they are. So journalists should take photographs of children at eye level, stop filming if the children refuse to be filmed, avoid making the children act anything out, use anonymity, and avoid posting pictures or videos of children on social media. So were you guys aware of these guidelines?
Every journalist's most important tool is his or her instinct. I think we all have a kind of instinct for like what is right, what is wrong, what we can do, what we can't. I mean, obviously there are violations along the way, but like all of those guidelines that we saw that when it comes to reporting with children, I think those are all things that any good journalist, as we've said, would just do anyway, would just like naturally occur as like this is the right way to proceed.
One journalistic image that caused a lot of controversy in particular was the Kevin Carter one.
I think this raises the issue of to what extent should a journalist be putting himself into a story in terms of, I think most journalists like to try and do good with the reporting, even without being sort of really ideological about it, just to report on situations that are worthy of publicity and sympathy and so on.
But still, you're a human being. If I was a journalist, of course, it fits in my hands if I can. After taking the picture, of course, I would try to help the child you're saving alive.
Yeah, I think we all need to ask ourselves.
Common sense to us.
We all need to ask ourselves, like, what am I first? Am I a journalist or am I a human being? And I'm a human being first.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a really interesting story in the Columbia Journalism Review a while ago about this woman, I think she was a Los Angeles Times reporter, who was traveling with this kid in Mexico who was having a really tough time, and she watched him spend like days on end cleaning windshields in his city to make a little bit of money so that he could phone his family in the States. And all the while as this woman was watching this, she had a phone. She had like she could make free long distance calls. She could have just given the kid the phone and said, here, use my phone, call your family. But she decided not to. And her reasoning was that she would have affected the story. I mean, if that was me, I would have just given the kid my phone and said, here, call your family. I mean, I think that's taking it too far. Like when you
I think for me, what Stephen is talking about, what you have to do there is you have to decide yourself, what are you willing to do or not do. In that case, if you're going to help that child, you shouldn't be writing that story. I mean, you should not be in that position in the first place where you're waiting to watch them make a phone call.
No, I disagree. You can write a story.
A different story.
Then
I mean, you can, sure.
Story,
I mean, I'm not saying you never cover poor children,
but then if you write a different story and keep your humanities, and so be it.
Sure.
I totally agree with Steve.
And I just think journalistically, like we get better stories when the people that we're writing about trust us. And so like if you make a small gesture, like when I'm reporting, when I'm interviewing people, I do what I can to like display my humanity, and I like show them that like I'm a decent and trustworthy person, because I think kind of selfishly they'll give me better quotes, like they'll open up more, they'll share their story. I think to do good reporting, like to do empathetic reporting, you as a reporter have to have some kind of bond. You have to have some kind of emotional exchange with the people you're writing about.
Sure.
And if you pretend that you're a robot, if you pretend that you're just a fly on the wall, that doesn't happen.
That's true, and I think as well, a lot of people distrust and dislike journalists, frankly. I think we've probably all experienced sort of hostility and so forth. While I think it's important to be empathetic and to be human, I think it's also necessary to keep yourself some way detached.
So I think it's a very grey area, I think, especially when we're talking about issues that provoke a big human reaction. We've been talking a lot about worldwide NGOs who tackle the issue of human rights, especially in relation to children. What do you think it is that children, these vulnerable children, really, really need?
Well, we would hope that more and more families would be aware that for the long-term prosperity of their families, the best thing is for the kids to be in school. If you deprive a child of an education so that he or she can work in a field like agriculture, it might be a short-term necessity, but like one would hope that parents would make whatever sacrifices they could to have their children in school so that they can get an education. And when they reach adulthood, they can have some other kind of job.
But I don't think that's problem should be solved at the family level. I'm pretty sure many families already know that.
Yeah.
The problem is it should be solved at the state level. You need the government who say, okay, child labor is forbidden, school is mandatory. This is what happened in Korea. Korea after the war was a very, very, very poor country, but still there were not many child labor because there was this, people know that education is good for the kids, so everybody was sacrificing themselves to put their kids in school, and we see the result today. Like we can explain the very fast development of Korea thanks to this focus on education.
Without being fatalistic, though, I do think the issue of child labour can be more complicated than it might first seem. While I think we could all agree that certainly the most severe forms of exploitation need to be tackled, there is the question of unintended consequences. A good example of that is in the early 90s in the United States, a Democratic senator proposed a bill to ban the import of goods created through child labor.
Okay.
And what actually happened was in Bangladesh, a lot of the factories, the garment makers, let go of their underage workers in anticipation of the economic sanctions that could result. But then what Oxfam actually found was, much to their dismay, was that a lot of those children then went into work at smaller companies with even worse conditions, or even worse, ended up in things like prostitution.
Right.
So, these topics often have a lot of different levels of complexity. I think people need to think about very carefully before just saying, okay, let's just stop child labor, sign a bill into law. Sometimes it's more complicated.
Okay. So it looks like the global community is kind of taking steps in the right direction, but hopefully there will be greater efforts in the future to better protect children from excessive labour and protect their human rights as well, maintaining their safety and well-being at the same time. So, John, on Newstellers, at the end of the show, we always wrap up with a final headline which summarises the topic that we've been talking about. I'll let you go last since you're a newcomer today. Would anyone like to volunteer to go first?
I thought we'd make the new guy go first. No, I'll go first. I would say, the children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way.
Sounds very familiar, those words.
Yeah, I didn't make that up myself.
I would say children's rights are always first.
Okay.
My headline would be, don't accept child labor under any circumstances.
Okay. John, are you ready?
Yeah, I would say that children's rights are vital, but we need to think of the consequences and approach things in a very careful and methodical way.
Bit of a long headline, but
I work for a magazine.
I'm sure we're Well, John, I hope you enjoyed your first time with us on Newstellers.
Yes, very much. It was very interesting and a lot of fun as well to talk about these issues. I always enjoy a good debate.
We've very much enjoyed listening to your insights on the topic, and we look forward to seeing you next week, as well as the rest of my wonderful panel. Hope you enjoyed the talk too.
As always.
And join us viewers next week for a whole new global talk show, Newstellers. We will be open for any opinions or requests on our official website as well as our Facebook page. Are there any specific days in your native countries to celebrate children?
I didn't even know about it. I never saw it being observed. Grown-ups in Canada usually tell children that they have it very easy. And they should be thankful just for being a kid.
In my hometown in Madrid, we had a lot of fun there, and I had those great memories about the Children's Day.
Just imagine a miniature running around.
After little girls.
What kind of image do you have? What is that?